Hello, everyone. Eric Grenier here, and welcome to the 85th episode of the Writ Podcast. This week, I'm joined by my friend Philippe J. Fournier of 338canada.com, L'actualité and POLITICO Canada. We're going to just talk about the numbers, the polls, the projections, federally, provincially, and everything in between. Philippe, comment ça va?
Good morning, Eric. It's great to speak with you again. I'm very glad to be on this podcast, I think for the fourth or fifth time or something like that. Yeah, I think I'm a regular now.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You're absolutely a regular. So then it means that we can just dive right in because we're both so used to it. So, we're going to talk about the federal polling. And I think the first question I think we have to talk about, because it's the one I think most people are asking right now, is are we starting to see any impact from this Chinese interference election story on the numbers themselves?
I think it's too early because right now we look at the numbers. Okay, the Liberals have had some not so good polls at below the 30% mark. Angus Street Institute, the Abacus data, 29. However, this is still within the margin of error of the regular 31, 32% that we have seen in the past, 5 years or something. And so maybe there will be some impact because, of course, the wear and tear of time at some point will get to the Liberals and Justin Trudeau. But if there had been some impact, I think it would be more dramatic than this. So I think it's too early right now to tell.
Yeah, I think that's true. That if we would have seen a huge impact, I think it would have already came up. Because if you remember after the SNC Lavalin story,
absolutely,
the Liberal numbers just tanked right away. But I do think there might be some signs of trouble going forward. That Angus Reid Institute, we're recording this on Thursday morning, so that poll had just been published, and it did show a pretty significant drop in Justin Trudeau's own approval ratings. And I think we're seeing a little bit of that kind of thing in the Abacus data polling we've seen in terms of positive impressions for the Prime Minister. So I do think it's having a negative impact, maybe on the brand of Justin Trudeau, but for the voting intentions, I'm not sure if we're seeing that it's really dragging it down. And it doesn't seem to be helping the Conservatives.
No, absolutely not. I mean, the Conservatives are stuck at the 35 to 34% range. We've seen Abacus data at 37. Now it's going down to 34. So, the Liberal voters, traditional Liberal voters, are not jumping on the Pierre Poilievre train. It's not happening. They seem to be either not answering the polls, or maybe a few of them say they will vote New Democrat, but we usually know how that works during a campaign, depending on how tight the campaign would be. But very little impact. We've been stuck in this in this scenario since the SNC Lavalin. You mentioned the Liberals never recovered from the SNC Lavalin affair. They were close to 40% in voting intentions in the early 2019. They went down to the low 30s and have never recovered since, and we're now in 2023.
With the exception of like the pandemic.
Yeah, a little bump in the pandemic. Yeah. That's true. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. But that was a bit of an unnatural sort of position. But yeah, and it does make you think when you look at the numbers that you see from Pierre Poilievre, his negative ratings, which in that Angus Reid Institute poll today were quite high. We're not seeing as high negative ratings in the Abacus data one, but it does suggest that there is a pretty low ceiling for the Conservatives. So it's like the Liberals and the Conservatives are both really working in a very narrow band of support.
And yet we have this NDP, this third option, supposedly, that has a huge target right in front of it and cannot seem to hit the mark, and is still stuck between 18 and 20% in voting intentions. And if I may, I looked at I deconstructed the last Léger poll that we had in Quebec. It had both the provincial and the federal voting intentions, and you could see the crosstabs. And I wrote on this in L'Actualité. And if you look at CAQ voters, of course, the CAQ in Quebec still very popular, still first by over 20 points in voting intentions. But you isolate these CAQ voters and you ask them, who do you vote for federally? And the numbers are as follows. Of course, it's a modest sample size. We have to be careful, but it was 39% Liberal, 37% Bloc Québécois, and the Conservatives at 14%. Among CAQ voters. This is, suburban, moderately right of center voters that Pierre Poilievre is supposed to gain in an election. And among CAQ voters, he's at 14%. So it's not good news for the Liberals, but it's not better news for the Conservatives, at least right now.
Yeah, and I wanted to talk a little bit about each of the parts of the country. So why don't we just start with Quebec? Because we haven't seen the Conservatives doing quite well under Pierre Poilievre. His numbers are really bad in terms of his personal ratings in Quebec. Really early on, it's quite shocking to see how unpopular he's become in Quebec already. And it does seem to be keeping the Conservatives at their base. But as you mentioned with that poll, not getting a lot of the CAQ support, getting more among the Eric Duhem Conservatives at the provincial level. But we also have seen a lot of disagreement in the polls in terms of where the Liberals are, where the Bloc is. Sometimes the Bloc is way ahead. Sometimes the Liberals are way ahead. Yeah. What's your read on where things actually are in Quebec?
That's very interesting, Eric, because I have noticed that, but I made me go back to the polls that we had before the 2019 and 2021 elections, and we had the same sort of disagreements. The Bloc Québécois polling, Bloc Québécois, I think it's a hard party to poll for pollsters, especially outside Quebec. We've seen numbers as low as 25 and as high as 38% in the province. Of course, this is a dramatically different outcome in Quebec. The Bloc at 38% would win close to 50 seats, right? So I'll be very careful. I'll go with the average, but it does seem that the Bloc Québécois would take some of that none of the above vote, which has been the story of the Bloc Québécois for most of its history now. But that none of the above vote is not going to the Conservatives in Quebec. And we've discussed this before. If the Conservatives don't make any gains in Quebec, then they have to really make big gains in Ontario and Atlantic Canada to go to a strong minority or even sometimes a majority. We don't see that right now, even though the Liberals are flailing in the numbers.
Yeah, in Ontario, you just mentioned that. I think that is proving to be the biggest problem for the Conservatives. Most of the polls have the Conservatives either tied with the Liberals. There's a couple of polls that sometimes have the Liberals ahead, but it's never more than a couple points, right? Exactly. So even when we've seen polls like when Abacus had the Conservatives ahead by 7 or 6 or 8 points, or the Angus Reid Institute poll today that had the Conservatives up by 6, the gap in Ontario is usually at most 2, 3, 4 points. And for the Conservatives, that a lot of that is going to be, in a way, wasted votes out in rural Ontario, and it does seem to be a big problem. The Angus Reid Institute poll that was put out on Thursday, when it had breakdowns for Toronto and the GTA, the Liberals were still leading in the GTA. Yeah. So when you see those kinds of numbers, it still looks like the Liberals have a little bit of a seat advantage. I think your projections currently have the Conservatives a little bit further ahead in terms of the seats, but
it's a statistical tie. It's that close. Yeah, exactly.
It does seem that the Conservatives have a real problem breaking through in Ontario, which they haven't been able to do in now almost 10 years.
That's true. Harper in his majority did have, I think he had 45% in Ontario, but that was the freak election of 2011 when the Liberals were led by Michael Ignatieff. What a bad nightmare that was for the Liberals. So yeah, as you said, in Ontario the numbers usually it's from Liberal +2 to Conservative +3. So this is the definition of a statistical tie. That's not good enough for the Conservatives. Unless we see dramatic shifts in Quebec and Atlantic Canada, that's not good enough. It won't be good enough for the Liberals either. I mean, the projections that you mentioned right now, I have, the two parties within 10 seats of each other with an uncertainty of 30 seats. And so it is a statistical tie. These numbers suggest that Pierre Poilievre does have a low ceiling and that the Liberals, the wear and tear, it does hurt them. However, I still would go back to those pre-2019 and 2021 polls. At some point, the summer 2019, Andrew Scheer was going to be prime minister. He was on the cover of L'Actualité at the last, it was decided in, not the last minute, but it was decided that spring because he was leading in the polls, and that lead just eroded as the campaign went on. And we saw the same thing going on with Erin O'Toole in 2021. He was in the lead at some point and then he lost it. So we're not predicting the next election here, but this, the wear and tear of time is, working on the Liberals, and this is going to be really hard to reverse.
Yeah. If we move out to British Columbia, the polls there have been better for the Conservatives. They seem to be usually leading, sometimes by 5-10 points, but they're usually leading against the NDP.
Yeah.
So it almost seems like the Liberals are definitively in third place in BC.
I would be very careful with those numbers, though. You know as well as I do that the polling in BC is usually all over the place. When you look at the charts, those dots, those huge margins, they're all over the place. And let's not forget that in the last election, the Liberals finished third in BC in the popular vote. Yet they won the most seats in the province because it's a very efficient urban suburban vote. The wasted vote that you mentioned for the Conservatives in the mountain in the Rockies, they win by 50-60%. It's the same problem that they have in Alberta. They have to at some point court those suburban urban voters, and Pierre Poilievre, he's doing a little bit better than his predecessor, but so far it's not a guaranteed win at all for Pierre Poilievre.
Yeah, and in the stronghold regions, I guess we can call it that, the prairies, Alberta for the Conservatives, the Liberals still 40 plus in Atlantic Canada. That doesn't seem to be moving around at all.
No, there's a little movement. I mean, this Angus Street poll had me, of course, the sample size are small for Atlantic Canada, but it had a provincial breakdown. And you see that in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, the Liberals and the Conservatives would be in a statistical tie. Now, that would be an improvement for the Conservatives, but how many seats is that? Maybe 6 or 7 more? It's not a huge harvest. They will take it if it materializes, but Atlantic Canada is not where the Conservatives will win the election. But it's where the Liberals could lose their 155 to 160 seats that they had in the last 2 elections.
Okay, so I asked you ahead of time. Now the budget's going to be coming later in March, so we're not really expecting that the NDP is going to vote against the Liberals and force an election. But there is still the possibility that could happen. There's still the possibility that something related to Chinese election interference will force the NDP to give up their support of the government. So I wanted you to assess on a scale of 1 to 10, and I'll do the same thing, what incentives each of the parties have to force an election this spring, either by defeating the government or, in the case of the Liberals, engineering their own fall or dissolving Parliament. So we'll start with the Liberals. And Philippe, why don't you go first on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being they have very little incentive, 10 being they have a lot of incentive on the Liberals calling an election or forcing an election this spring.
That's very interesting, Eric, because I tried to run the scenarios in my mind to see, okay, if they did want to go into an election, why would that be? And the same for not going into an election. I could see both scenarios unfold because, of course, time is not on the side of the Liberals. And I'm guessing that some Liberals really want to face off against Pierre Poilievre sooner rather than later. But I just, with the Chinese interference story, with the ethical problems that the Liberals have had, the poor number in the polls, the fact that the Liberals do have runway to stretch this minority government until 2025 or maybe next, we'll see. So I give it a 2. I could see why some Liberals will want to go. I'm not sure that the country would react really well, so I say the Liberals will try to avoid it this time.
Okay. Yeah, I think that makes sense, and I think that's what they will do. For me, I did give it just a 1. I feel like they have so little incentive right now, mostly because forcing an election right now with the story breaking about the Chinese election interference allegations, it would seem like they were trying to cover something up and get ahead of it. And I think that they would never be able to escape this issue during a campaign. It would dog them throughout it and would eventually lead them to their defeat. They have a much better incentive to wait until we have a little bit more information, maybe an inquiry set up. I don't know. But yeah, right now I would say it's a 1. Okay, so let's go to the Conservatives, and here I'll go first for the Conservatives. So they understand that the government's probably going to survive, that the NDP is unlikely to defeat it, so they can take the position of, wanting to defeat the government and voting against it and calling for an election and all that kind of stuff. I don't know if they really want one. When I think about it, though, and I had to give them a number on a scale of 1 to 10, I am only going to give them a 6. I think they have a small incentive to try to force an election and agree to an election being called. I think that it would be really bad if they voted to support the government to avoid an election. That would probably be the worst thing they could do. But in terms of their popularity, But I would give him a 6 because the polls suggest they could make some gains and maybe form a minority government. Who knows how that might function? Maybe the Bloc Québécois would support the Conservatives on a case-by-case basis. But I think that Pierre Poilievre still has a big problem on his own personal numbers. I think that what we've seen from him in some scrums lately suggests that he might not do very well on a 5 or 6 week campaign dealing with the media every day, 2 or 3 debates. He needs to, I think, get a little bit more comfortable with the version of what Pierre Poilievre on the campaign trail is going to be, because he still sometimes reverts to his conservative leadership, Pierre Poilievre. And I think that would probably make him a bit too unlikable to win among those kind of swing voters that are accessible to the Conservatives but currently aren't with them.
You know, you make good points. You're making me change my mind. The thing is, if I were a conservative strategist, I would wait. I know they seem to be very eager, but for the same reason for the Liberals, time is not on the Liberals' side. Everything that happens right now and goes badly is on the foot of the Liberals. So on the feet of the Liberals. So why would you push it? You're supposed to be the government in waiting. You have this luxury of saying, look at the NDP Liberal coalition. So if I'm a strategist for the Conservatives, I say, you can thump your chest as much as you want, but wait it out. So I would give it a 3. I don't think they have much incentive right now because the Liberals are in a hard place. And the numbers for the Conservatives aren't that great, so they're not better than Erin O'Toole's or Andrew Scheer's at the same point. So just wait it out and see how it goes. Of course, they could wait it out and it could get worse, but I think it's a risk that they could take.
Okay, how about the NDP? So the NDP probably is the one with the most agency in this because we more or less know how the Conservatives and the Bloc would vote. We know the Liberals probably want to continue governing for a little while, so it's up to the NDP in many ways. So what do you give them on a scale of 1 to 10?
If the NDP had any sort of competent leadership, it would be a 9 or an 8. I mean, you're never going to get that big of a target to hit the Liberals with and to turn around and say, see, folks, we brought you dental care, we're bringing you farmer care. It's going to take a while still. We can be the party of the working class. But they're not doing that right now. Jagmeet Singh has been such a disappointment for a long time now, but when I see comments on the polls for the favorability of the leaders, you see Jagmeet Singh is higher than everybody else. Yeah, he's higher because he's not a threat to the status quo. Of course, Liberals like him because he's just there and he doesn't push it around too much. So the problem is half the NDP caucus is in BC. And the numbers for the NDP in BC are not that great. So you really want to push. Imagine you're pushing to go into an election and you lose seats. You go from the 40-ish that Mulcair had 5 years ago, and then you could have, 18, 19, 20 seats, and so you reduce your position. The NDP will never be as important in the House of Commons than they are right now. So since their numbers are not that great, their leadership is not that great, I would wait it out. So I would also give it a 2. No election for the NDP. No, not much incentive, I think.
Okay, wow. 9 or 8, that's a lot that I would not go that far. Okay, so I give them 2 different scores.
Okay.
The first score is if they want to retain, as you said, the influence they have in Parliament, then it's a 1, because the odds that they will get the exact same balance of power next time with a government that is willing to work with them seems pretty low. And there's a big risk that there could be a majority government. There's a risk that they could not have influence with a conservative minority, etc. So right now, it's what they have, and what they have is what they would like to keep having, which is influence. So keep it as a 1. But if instead that the NDP feels like it's more important to make electoral gains, regardless of whether they have influence in the House or not, then I would maybe say it's more of a 4. Because I think that the NDP could look at the situation and say that the Liberals are not very strong right now, if the campaign goes badly, the Liberals are probably going to lose some votes, and we're going to get some of those, and maybe we can win 5, 10 more seats, and that's all that we care about is having more NDP MPs. Doesn't matter if it's a majority government for Pierre Poilievre or not. So I could see that argument being made, and which is why I'd give it a 4, but I wouldn't give it a 6 because I think that the odds are that they don't gain that many seats, and it would be an exercise in futility, just losing seats for the sake of it.
Absolutely, and the seats in urban areas that they could win against the Liberals, you could say that if the Liberals lose 10 seats and then the NDP gains those seats, we have a greater advantage. But hang on, the Conservatives' base is not going anywhere right now. So an NDP would an NDP have much influence in a Conservative-led government, even if it's a minority? I'm not too sure.
Yeah, I don't think so. Okay, so we'll finish with the Bloc, which I find is often left out of this debate in terms of the role that it has in Parliament. It is still actually the third largest party. It's not the fourth. And if the Liberals lost support from the New Democrats, they could go to the Bloc. There could be things that they could find that the Bloc would be willing to support because that's the Bloc is there to get extra things for Quebec. So the Liberals, if they offered things, then the government could survive. So what's the incentives, though, you would give to the Bloc if it became a vote where they had the choice on a scale of 1 to 10?
The boring answer, my friend, would be a 5. I'm not sure I'm going for a 5. Let me run this. Yves-François Blanchet in 2019 and to some extent 2021 made gains on the coattails of the CAQ. But last year, before the Quebec election, we had a by-election in Marie-Victorin in which Yves-François Blanchet campaigned for the Parti québécois against the CAQ. The CAQ ended up winning that seat. And since then, there's been no love between the CAQ, François Legault, and the Bloc québécois. So they could want to go into election thinking they would make gains. He's not going to get help from François Legault this time. And it's been a major factor in the past 2 elections for Yves-François Blanchet. I think the Bloc québécois doesn't care if there's an election because they'll get their base, and that's pretty much it. They probably would get the balance of power, but they're not interested in a coalition regardless of who wins the most seats. So I guess the very boring answer for me would be a 5. They don't care. They would go, if there's an election, they'll go in, they'll win 30-odd seats. If there's no election, they'll keep doing what they do. I don't think it's a factor for them. So I could say a 4.9 or a 5.1, but I will go with the boring answer, I'm sorry, with a 5.
Okay, that's interesting. I'm going to give them a 7.
Okay.
And I'll tell you why. On the one hand, you look at the 2019 campaign, you look at the 2021 campaign. The Bloc started both of those campaigns in not the best position. The 2019 campaign, Blanchet had a good French language debate, and that helped boost the party, and they were able to get the 32 seats that they won in that election. In 2021, again, they were starting to falter a little bit during the campaign. It seemed a little bit unfocused. Then there was the English language debate, and that helped boost Yves-François Blanchet again. So in both of those cases, it was almost like something manna from heaven came to save the Bloc campaign. So I don't know if they can count on that again. If there's the old questions about, I can't remember what the word is that's often used, but the usefulness of the Bloc and whether it should be there or not. If people are talking about that on week 3, then maybe the Bloc is in trouble again. But I'm going to give them a 7 because they are fighting primarily the Liberals, right? In a lot of the seats that they would like to pick up. There's a couple of them with the NDP or the Conservatives, but it's primarily the Liberals. And I think that the Liberals do have a number of issues that are bubbling up that are serious vulnerabilities for them in Quebec. There was the appointment of the Islamophobia person that was not very popular move in Quebec. There's the issues over language and how some of the Liberal MPs on the island of Montreal are going to vote against or want to seemingly vote against the changes that are being made to the Official Languages Act. And I feel like those are issues that during a campaign, if they're not handled well, could really crater Liberal support, and that would help the Bloc. And I think there's more upside to a campaign for the Bloc than there would be for the Liberals in Quebec. And for that reason, if there could be an election, I think now might not be actually a bad time for the Bloc to try to take advantage of some of the bad stories that maybe haven't had enough of an impact yet on Liberal support, but in a campaign and forcing Justin Trudeau to have to talk about them, there's more of a chance of something happening.
And the Bloc did lose some very close races against the Liberals in the last election. You remember Brome-Missisquoi, and I think it was Châteauguay-Lacolle, 12 votes in Châteauguay-Lacolle difference. So you would think that the Bloc Québécois could be able to win those seats against an aging or a worn-down Liberal brand. And of course, Pierre Poilievre not being that popular in Quebec, you would be correct, but we're not talking about, the good old days of Gilles Duceppe with 50 seats. We're talking about maybe a handful more seats. So I think that, right now they're happy with the situation. They can blame the NDP and the Liberals for everything. So
everybody can always do that. That's always an option. You can always blame someone else. Okay, why don't we move to the provincial scene for the last segment of the podcast. There is a by-election taking place today as we're recording in Hamilton Centre in Ontario, but of course we can't predict the future. It's probably going to be an NDP win. Maybe I'm going to regret this having said it.
It should be. It should be. Yeah, it'll be a big surprise.
If it's not it was a big surprise. Yeah. But anyway, there was the by-election on Monday in Saint-Henri-Sainte-Anne that Quebec Solidaire was able to win. They got around 45% of the vote. A big jump from the last election when they lost it to the Liberals by 8.5 points. The Liberal vote dropped to 29%. It's the worst result they've had in that riding, at least since it was created, but probably forever. Yeah. What's the big takeaway from this? Is this a Quebec Solidaire win or a Liberal loss?
Both. Both. You could see this win from a mile away. And I'll say this because there's been a lot of chatter online. There was that lone Main Street poll in Saint-Henri-Sainte-Anne that I commissioned. And people, a lot of observers online have asked me, once the poll was out, it was out on my blog. I didn't put it in L'actualité or Politico. Why didn't you update your projection? Because my projection had neck and neck Liberals and Quebec Solidaire. And I'm going to be very careful in what I say here, Eric, because I don't want to dump on Main Street. Main Street, they do a lot of polls. And most of them are good, and sometimes they take a big risk with a by-election like this, and they miss. The second I saw those numbers, I felt suspicious, and I decided it's an editorial decision from me. I decided not to include it in my projection because it felt wrong, and I don't usually do this. But it felt wrong because, of course, I live in Montreal. I'm close to that seat. I don't live in that seat, but I'm close to that seat, and I speak to the political parties here, and the vibe was very much that Quebec Solidaire was going to win. But since I'm a numbers guy, I don't want to be a pundit. I'm very careful, build my new career in not being an opinion guy. So I went on TV and I explained my position, and I was asked who was going to win, and in my head I was like, Quebec Solidaire is going to win, but the numbers disagree. So what am I supposed to do? So I just took the projection, left it there, and figured, I think it's going to be a close vote, but Quebec Solidaire has a hell of a machine, get out the vote machine, and the Liberals right now, the Liberal vote is demoralized and depressed, and so I was not surprised at all from those results, and the Liberals are in big trouble. And I'm not talking about the Ontario Liberals, because I was asked who's in more trouble, the Ontario Liberals or the Quebec Liberals, and it's not even close for me. It's the Quebec Liberals. The Quebec Liberals are done. They will not recover for a long time. The last Léger poll had them at 4% among francophones. And if the Anglophones in Quebec and the cultural communities don't support them by huge numbers, they're just not going to die. They're still going to be there with a few seats, but they won't be a force in Quebec. And this is a party that's been there since Confederation. So I know it's a bold statement, but I think the Liberals are in huge trouble, and you and I probably won't see a Liberal win in Quebec for our lifetimes.
All right. Well, I'm going to keep this, and if we are both alive in 50, 60 years, then we'll see if you were right. I do think you're right that the Ontario Liberals are in a better spot, oddly enough. I mean, they did win at least the popular vote, or the province-wide
Against
vote in
the
the last Ontario election.
yeah.
And I've heard Corey Tenike on the Curse of Politics podcast, who deeply involved in the PC campaign, saying that the Liberals are one good leader away from winning an election. I think that's probably right. It's hard to imagine the Liberals in Quebec being one good leader away. In part because it's hard to imagine who wants to lead the party. There's not a huge rush of candidates rushing to run for this leadership, because, as you said, like, it does seem like the party is just being reduced to its core areas. And as we saw in the by-election, if the Anglophones and the Allophones that support the party don't come out to vote, they lose a seat like this, right? This is a seat that I think 44% of the population speaks a language other than French at home, and the Liberals got 29% of the vote. So either they lost a lot of that to Quebec Solidaire, which is a possibility, but a lot of the voters that they usually could count on also just did not feel motivated to go out. And that won't matter in the West Island when they're going to win with 70% anyway. But in these ridings, there's a couple of them in the middle of Montreal that are these kind of like split ridings between Francophones and non-Francophones. That's going to be death for them. And then they're just going to be reduced to, 13, 14 seats maybe?
Yeah, maybe a little more than that. It's just that with the perception will be that the Liberals are le parti des Anglais, and for a province whose big chunk, critical mass of voters are still nationalists. They're not necessarily separatists, but they're nationalists. Le Parti des Anglais is not going to cut it in the regions. And we're not that far removed. I mean, this name, the Parti des Anglais, or the English Party, it's been thrown around a lot. But Philippe Couillard in 2014 won the Francophone vote. It's not that far away. And he did not win because of Anglophones. He won because he won the Francophones. He won all the seats in the Mauricie, Quebec City, Bellechasse. He won seats in the Saguenay and Abitibi. It was Francophones that put the Liberals there in 2014. But since then, it's been going down. And who's going to go there? I mean, I know for a fact, and I can't name names, of course, but I know for a fact that the Liberal candidate that was chosen for this supposedly stronghold, it was not their first choice. Who would want to go sit right now for the Quebec Liberals, be a backbencher at the National Assembly for $100,000 a year? I mean, it's a good salary, but if you want to have star candidates, how are you going to recruit people? So that's why I'm saying the Liberals are in huge trouble, and you would need several scandals from the other parties to have people flock back to the Liberals. And Quebec Solidaire, their growth has been very steady, very stable. They went from 0 to 1 to 3 to 10 seats, now 11, now 12. And this bloc in Montreal, this gentrifying, sectors of Montreal, it's not going to stop. It's still, they're going to grow until the next election. They won't win Drummondville and Quebec City, of course, but I think they're going to win those Montreal seats that the Liberals used to take for granted. I don't see it reversed. So it was a very interesting by-election. The result did not surprise me, but boy, is it bad news for the Quebec Liberals.
Yeah. But what about for Quebec Solidaire? Because you said, it is growth, but it is... if the Liberals are being reduced to their essence, it seems in a way that Quebec Solidaire might be concentrating itself too, right? It's like it's being, in a pot, and it's just boiling down to the more and more of the Montreal area. And it does seem to me that Quebec Solidaire needs to be very careful that 9 of its 12 seats now are on the island of Montreal. The other 2 being, there's 2 in Quebec City in the downtown core and 1 in Sherbrooke.
Yeah.
But there is a danger that Quebec Solidaire thinks too much about winning that 10th seat on the island of Montreal and that 11th seat, but not about winning a 4th seat off the island.
Hey, they're trying. Last campaign or before the last campaign, you saw Gabriel Nadeau-Dubois go down to St. Lawrence and go to Rimouski, and they went into the regions and still got 15, 16, 17% of the votes there. So it's a Montreal party. I mean, in the Parti Québécois, in the meantime, they've been polling okay since the election, and they think that sovereignty is on the march because they had one good poll.
They're the second. They're the second political force in
Oh my
Quebec now.
God! I saw I saw that 18%. We're the second force, but they do have a point that in the last Léger poll, 38% would support sovereignty. So that means that sovereigntists don't vote for the Parti Québécois. That's what it means. But Quebec's. I mean, you can't blame Quebec Solidaire for wanting to win those seats in Montreal, but a left-wing party, a progressive left-wing party, will not do well in the regions of Quebec, especially when you have a CAQ, nationalist CAQ that's so strong. I think it's the same case that we see in other jurisdictions in North America. Progressive left or center parties have a hard time winning in rural areas. So the Quebec Solidaire still has a very low ceiling, but that floor keeps going up. So Quebec will not change governments for quite a while. It's gonna take a few scandals or a few resignations. So.
Yeah, well, you never know what can happen.
You never
right?
know. You never know. But we according to the numbers right now, it's been so stable. That's the thing.
Yeah. Well, the lowest form of political analysis is that anything can happen.
Let's not go there, then.
Yeah. Speaking of anything can happen, I'm not sure how closely you're watching the election in Prince Edward Island. Are you running projections for the?
No,
for that
I'm
election?
not. I'm not. It's way too risky. I don't want to have screenshots. 800 voters can mean a victory, and it's not. And there won't be much polling. I mean, we had one from Main Street Research earlier this week. I follow it from afar. I read the news, but I won't run a model. It's too risky.
Okay.
What about you?
I did actually.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, yeah. I love every election. So I always try.
I love it too. But go ahead.
Yeah.
I'm listening. Yeah.
Well, I always try to dig deep. It is hard though sometimes to find, podcasts and things to listen to about every single election. So you do sometimes have to dig a little bit deeper, I guess, if you're not familiar with the sources as much. But the election we had Teresa Wright and Stuart Neatby on the podcast last week. I think it is going to be an interesting result. And I did actually get a couple questions on the Substack chat about the PEI election. We'll do at least two of them. I'd like to see if you're going to, if you'd like to play along. We got one from Jake, and he actually had the same idea of a scale. So he said, on a scale of 1 to 10, how silly was the decision of the Liberal leader to run against the Green leader in his own riding in PEI? And he says he will allow negative scores. And I think that might be what you have to do. So the story here is that in New Haven, Rocky Point, which is where Peter Bevan Baker is the Green leader, and he's held that seat since 2015, the Liberals, who just named their leader earlier this year or at the end of last year, who does not have a seat, decided to run against him in that riding. She does not live there. The Liberals were, I think, 30 points behind the last campaign, and it just seems like a crazy thing to do to ensure that you probably lose and don't have a seat after the next election. So on a scale of 1 to 10, if negative scores are allowed, I'll give it a -10. I just think there's no good reason to have done this. And for the Liberals, it signals that their main opponent is the other opposition party rather than the government.
I went back to the numbers to make sure because I did see that 54%, I believe, for the vote for Mr. Devin Baker. So you mean you need to switch 20 points or 25 points? And I don't think Mr. Devin Baker has been unpopular or anything. So this is an example of going all in with a 2 and a 7 in your pocket. So I've seen some defense of this. I mean, Mr. Vickers in New Brunswick went into Miramichi, right? It was not a good seat for him, but you figured, okay, if he does win this seat, that means the Liberals did well. Perhaps that's the thinking. It's not a very good thinking when you could be reduced to how many seats will the Liberals win in this one?
Well,
3,
that brings me
4,
to my next question.
2? I mean, it's not going to be. It's going to be a handful.
Well, that's the question I got from Marcus Mayer, who asked. Actually, no, sorry, that's a different question. This is a question I wanted to ask. Okay.
No, but just
the question
hang on.
wanted to
Hey,
ask.
okay, go ahead. Yeah.
No, go ahead, finish.
But well, thing is, we did have an over under in December, and we mentioned PEI. I think our over under was 20 seats for the PC.
Yeah, and
I think
4.5 for the Greens. Yeah.
Yeah. It's right now. If you ask me to redo that over under, I'm slamming the over for the PCs. It's going to be more than 20 seats, and there's 29 in total. So there's not much left for the other parties. It could be 25 seats, and suddenly the opposition is 2 or 3 people.
Yeah. It's 27.
It's 27. Sorry, apologies.
Yes, 27. So even less. So before I get to my last question, there was a question from Marcus Mayer who was asking whether the problems that we've seen with the federal Green Party, if it hurts the PEI Greens. I don't know if you have anything thoughts on that, but for me, it's just I think that this is the case of the federal Greens following along in the provincial Green footsteps and happy to take whatever extra support they can gain from the success of the provincial party. So I don't think there would be much of a link between the two. I don't know if you disagree with that.
I looked at the New Brunswick polling, and the Greens, even though they're not, surging, they haven't been hurt. The provincial Greens in New Brunswick haven't been hurt by the federal Greens, so I think the same thing should apply to PEI.
Okay, so the last question I have, and we'll end on this. What about a 27-0 result? It's happened in PEI, happened in 1935. It happened in New Brunswick in 1987. I made a mistake on my my weekly writ this past week. The Confederation of Regions did not exist yet in 1987. They weren't a role there, so that's a correction on my part. Sorry about that. But it was a sweep in 1987. There's been a couple elections PEI where there's only one opposition member. That happened like in 93 and 2000. But that Main Street poll, 59% for the PCs. Yeah. It was 23 for the Liberals, 14 for the Greens. If you get 59% of the vote and it's uniform, almost as if it looked to be nearly uniform, that seems like you could get a clean sweep.
What would be even more impressive, I think Mr. McKenna in 87 gained power after a long reign of the progressive conservatives, right? So yeah. Mr. King in the PEI would retain power by increasing his majority with an almost sweep. That would be impressive. All the elections. I'm not sure that happened before. So a clean sweep would be a very funny result, of course, not for democracy in PEI, but from outsiders looking at this. And of course, what would happen then? Would they have to name a shadow cabinet like Mr. McKenna did, or would they invite journalists and a legislator to ask questions to the government? It would be very interesting. If we move the over-under line, this doesn't count. This is exhibition. But if I move the over-under line at 24.5, would you be tempted by the over?
I would be tempted by the over right now.
Yeah.
Based on that Main Street poll. If it was on the narrative poll that was a bit earlier that had 49% for the PCs, I think I'd probably take the under. Yeah. So I don't know where we'll end up by the end of the campaign, but. And you make a good point. Like in 1987, that was after the Hatfield years. There was a lot of turmoil in New Brunswick related to language. And in 1935, in PEI, that was the Depression, and so it was a crisis of throw the bums out. This would be if it's pulled off, it's a stamp of approval of the previous 4 years.
Oh, absolutely.
Which would be pretty remarkable. I still kind of think that Peter Bevan Baker is a well-known enough person that he will probably himself be able to survive. So at least it would be 26-1. But yeah, I don't know. If these numbers continue, I think it could be a really short night on April 3rd.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's the tour of the table.
I think we should just 1 minute, if I may, Eric.
Sure.
We have to mention Alberta here,
because
I listened to you on the very good West of Center podcast with the very excellent Kathleen Perry, and I heard you say that the Alberta election was a toss-up, and it made me frown a little bit. Would you expand on this just a minute here?
A toss-up is when it's very close and you can't say which side is going to win. I know that your projections. Yeah, I know your projections. I think have a little north of 50 seats for the UCP, right?
I think it's 49, yeah.
49. Okay, a little south of it. Yeah, I think it is a toss-up. So I guess we could discuss why you think it's not, because I think that it is the polls are very close, obviously. Yeah. The polls in Calgary are very close, and I think that the NDP is doing pretty well in a lot of those polls. They tend to be leading more often, I think, than not.
Yeah.
I think that Rachel Notley is more popular than Danielle Smith in Calgary, so she might be able to boost her numbers a little bit. And I think that Danielle Smith has the potential to kneecap her own campaign and help the NDP. On the other hand, I think the UCP has a huge turnout advantage in terms of its support among older people. So if the UCP won, I would find that less shocking than if the NDP won. But I do think it's a toss-up. I don't think it's like a 49-50, 37-38, or whatever it would be for the NDP. I think it's a bit closer than that, at least right now.
You make a very good point. I would say this, however. Is it close? In the vote count, it looks to be close. On the seat count, the floor of the UCP is just so rock solid. I mean, they start with 40 seats. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you don't need that much. And you mentioned in that podcast with Kathleen Perry that the numbers have shifted in Calgary compared to the last election. And you are correct. I think we're talking about a 25-point shift. So it's very impressive to see the NDP statistically tied with the UCP in Calgary. But the seat count, that's not enough. They can't tie the UCP and win. It's not. If they tie the UCP in Calgary, the NDP loses. They have to win Calgary by, I think, double digits to win the election, unless there's really something that we're missing. Because I have Banff, Kansas, I have both Lethbridges, Edmonton, and maybe half of Calgary. That's 38, 39 seats for the NDP, and I have a hard time finding those 7-8 extra seats that they would need to secure a win. We'll see if the numbers change. Of course, the election is in May. But for me right now, this is the UCP's election to lose. The UCP for me is a heavy favorite because of 85-15. 85%. I would say that the NDP win would really surprise me, and that would mean that the polls are wrong. Because if the polls are correct, the UCP is winning. That's why I chuckled. So, yeah.
You think that the NDP needs to be ahead by 10 points in Calgary to win the most seats?
They need to sweep Calgary. They don't need to win the most.
Are you talking about seats or vote when you said double digit?
I'm talking about winning seats. The double digit meant vote. I mean, if the vote in Calgary ends up being 47-45 in favor of the NDP, the UCP wins. That's not enough. They can't split Calgary. They have to sweep Calgary, or almost sweep. A split in Calgary is not good enough for the NDP. It would be great for them if you consider what happened 4 years ago. But the map really is advantageous to the UCP. So it's a slight disagreement that we have. We're not having a fight here. But I think it's the UCP's election to lose.
Okay. Yeah, well, like I said, if I had to give it odds, I'd probably do 55-45 UCP. You probably would give it a lot more than that. But I do think that NDP can win Calgary if they're only up by 3 or 4 points. I think they can. We'll see. I guess. Maybe I'll prove to be very wrong.
And maybe my confidence right now will be ill-advised, and I'll be wrong, and you'll have the permission to laugh at me in May. Don't worry.
Okay. All right. Well, the NDP is going to win in May, and the Quebec Liberals will be the next government.
Oh, God.
And you are going to eat crow. Actually, I don't disagree with you about the Quebec Liberals. They're in trouble. But it was a lot of fun to chat with you. I do enjoy just going over everything. I know this was a bit of a rambling, unfocused podcast, but I hope that the listeners will have enjoyed it.
Merci beaucoup, Eric. Take care. I very much enjoy speaking with you.